we are looking last, yeah, so last time from the textbook, we completed the introduction, which is this entire part. We understood the historical research method, and we understood the disciplines that are involved in writing history or researching history, right? And after we did all of this, I asked you to kind of revise it. The reason I asked you to revise it is because of the three things that we are going to study today, especially this, is quite important. So you need to know this, right? The historical research method, you need to understand that well to connect to what we are studying today. So I'll just go through the historical research method quickly so that you have an understanding even if you haven't revised. So this is it, right? And what we understood when we did this is that when we are doing historical research, the aim is to write a historical narrative. The aim is writing history, right? Itihas likhna wo hamara aim hai, right? And for that, there's always a process. To do anything, there is a process. And so what we understood is that all of these activities, how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 activities. So all of these 6 activities need to be done, but they will be done in a certain order. And what I put forward to you is that the first step in this order is to form a question कि मुझे क्या जानना है, right? वो question पहले हमें form करना है और उसके बाद एक idea बनाना है, a hypothesis कि मुझे लगता है ऐसे हुआ था. And then we conduct the various other steps in historical research. And at the end of it, we write the historical narrative, which means we write history, right? So this is the historical research method. This is the process of researching history, which ends in us writing history. Okay. So I hope that's clear to all of you. This is important for you to understand, for us to go ahead. If you have not understood, say no. If you have understood, say yes. I'll wait for at least 5 messages. Okay, thank you, Prachi. I need a yes in the chat box. Thank you, Chand. Thank you, Alfia. Thank you, Karthik. Okay, Chanda. So all yeses, nobody has said no. So I will move ahead. Keep this in mind, okay? Yeah, so this is all, we've done that last time. So today we're going to be doing the tradition of historiography. We'll start with that, 1.1. There are 3 paragraphs. If you've seen in the textbook, or let me show that to you so that we don't have any problems and confusion. So if you look at the textbook, right? So this is tradition of historiography. Now in this, you'll notice there are 3 paragraphs. In English writing, the purpose of a paragraph is to share an idea with the reader. So each paragraph has a main idea. And when we are studying history, it's very important that we are able to identify the main idea in each paragraph, right? If we identify the main idea in each paragraph, it becomes easier for us to understand and remember. If we don't understand the main idea in each paragraph, what we end up doing is reading each line and trying to by heart each line, sometimes without even understanding what is written, right? तो हमें हर पैराग्राफ का मेन आइडिया समझ के याद करना है. समझेंगे तो ऑटोमेटिकली याद होगा, राइट? नहीं तो क्या होगा, हर लाइन पढ़ के हम रट्टा मारने की कोशिश करेंगे और फिर कुछ होगा नहीं हमसे, क्योंकि बहुत सारा होता है, राइट, हिस्ट्री में. So I asked you to identify the main idea in each paragraph. If anyone has done that, you can share it with me in the chat box, the main idea for each paragraph. So you will share 1, and then you will say the first main idea, 2, second main idea, 3, third main idea. I'll give you 2 minutes. I'm waiting. So it's 8:08 now. I'll wait till 8:10. If any of you have identified the main idea in each paragraph for 3 paragraphs. Karthik, your understanding of the question is incorrect. What you are telling me is 1.3 development in Europe in the fields of scientific methods. So you are telling me the main idea of this topic. I am asking you the main ideas in this topic per paragraph, right? 1, 2, 3 paragraphs. This paragraph has one main idea. This paragraph has one main idea. And this paragraph has one main idea, right? What is the mudda of the paragraph, right? That's what I'm asking you for. So Prachi has managed to type out the first two paragraphs main idea. She says the first paragraph is basically about what historiography is, which is very correct, right? The first paragraph tells us historiography kya hai. The second paragraph tells us कि जब historian history लिखता है, right? When a historian writes history, what events he includes and what events he doesn't include. So what are the different styles of writing, right? When all of you write a composition, you write it in different styles. Similarly, historians also write history in different styles. And the third paragraph tells us about the tradition of writing history. यानी कि पहले के ज़माने से how are people writing history, right? How did the writing of history start in olden times, even when we never used to write? So come, we'll go through it now. Thank you, Chand. I've seen your answer as well. So we'll go through the text now. Where are we? All right. So tradition of writing historiography. So the first paragraph basically tells us what is historiography, right? So the first paragraph gives you the very important definition of historiography, right? And the definition of historiography is as follows. The writing of a critical historical narrative is known as historiography. The scholar who writes this narrative is known as the historian. So the definition of historiography is the writing of a critical historical narrative. Critical means very detailed, very well thought, right? When we criticize someone, तो हम सोच समझ के बोलते हैं कि आपके साथ ये गलत है, ये सही है. That is what criticize means, right? So critical means हमने बहुत सोच के हम लिख रहे हैं the historical narrative. Right? So when we think things through and we write the historical narrative, it is known as historiography. And then a separate point in that is the person who writes historiography, the person who writes history is called a historian, right? तो वो इंसान जो history लिखता है उसको बुलाते हैं historian. So that's the first thing we need to know in the first paragraph, right? Then we go on to the most important thing, which is the definition of a conceptual framework, right? That's what the second paragraph tells us. कि conceptual framework क्या है? Essentially, जो प्राची ने कहा, it's that only, right? So how a historian understands past events and then chooses to include or exclude them in his or her historical writing, right? So the conceptual framework decides the historian's writing style. To use an example for this, if I ask each of you, so what is a common experience all of you have had? If I ask, okay, so all of you are going to pick up ration, right? Most of you will be going to pick up ration. So I can ask all of you, how does ration distribution happen? Or how did the last ration distribution happen? And each of you will tell me a different story about the method of ration distribution. Your story will depend on your experience, right? And what you paid attention to, what you did not pay attention to. And the latter part is more important. Everybody pays attention to some things and does not pay attention to other things. So what you choose to pay attention to is, and what you choose not to pay attention to forms your conceptual framework. कि हम दुनिया को कैसे देखते हैं, कैसे समझते हैं. हर एक इंसान दुनिया को अलग तरीके से देखता है और समझता है. Similarly, each person looks at history. Each historian looks at history and understands history in a different way. And therefore, each person writes history in a different way. तो जो अलग-अलग scholars है, they all have a different style of writing based on their conceptual framework. Conceptual framework means what concepts are they using in their writing, right? So that's the broad idea. It's a very important idea. And if we go behind, right? So if we go here, you'll see in this piece, it says, understanding the references regarding time and space of the given historical events, and also the various conceptual frameworks used in historical research method. यानी कि अगर हमें भी हिस्ट्री लिखना है, राइट, तो हमें पहले समझना है कि कौन से टेक्निक्स है हिस्ट्री लिखने का, right? What are the conceptual frameworks that exist with which to write history? As we go ahead and learn about different scholars, you learn about their conceptual frameworks, right? And you'll understand how they looked at history. To give you an example, there are some historians who use the feminist conceptual framework, which is that they try to look at history from the eyes of women. So they write history from the eyes of women, right? Some people look at history from the conceptual framework of societal, how do you say, different levels in society, right? Ki, in the history of mankind, कौन से लोग पावर में हैं और वो दूसरे लोगों को दबाते, मतलब नीचा कैसे दिखाते हैं. That's also a way of understanding history, right? So there are different ways of understanding history, and there are different conceptual frameworks. So we need to understand that. It's very important towards our understanding of historiography, right? And the tradition of historiography. One second. Yeah. So the first paragraph tells us what is historiography. The second paragraph tells us what is a conceptual framework. So we've understood historiography is writing a critical narrative of history. We've understood the person who writes history is called a historian. And lastly, we understood, or secondly, we understood that everyone who writes history chooses to keep some events and not keep some events. What they choose to focus on basically decides their writing style, and that is called their conceptual framework. The concepts they use to decide what they will, that's the conceptual framework, right? And lastly, what we need to understand, I don't know why this isn't working properly. One second. Yeah, the last thing we need to understand is what was traditional historiography, right? So before we could read and write, people still wanted to know about history, right? So that time, what they used to do, they used to make songs. So in your textbook, you'll see the word ballads, you'll see paintings, right? So they had lots of different ways of recording history. That was not the same as how it is today, but the idea that should come through to you is कि पहले के ज़माने से भी लोग इतिहास का record रखते थे, right? How? Through songs, through paintings, through ballads and carvings, right? So this is what we need to capture in tradition of historiography. First, what is historiography? Who is a historian? What is a conceptual framework? And that in olden times also people would record history, right? So this is what we need to take away from here. It's a total of 3 points. If that's clear to all of you and I can move ahead, please send a yes in the chat box. Thank you, Prachi, Kartik, Chand. Karina, new name. Thank you. Chanda, yes. Okay, thank you. That's 5 of you. Please, everyone can send a yes, okay? The more yeses I see, the more participation I feel like there is in class. So, okay, great. Thanks, Ankit. Thanks, Fatima. Okay, so we'll go ahead. Now in your textbook, you'll see a do you know box, right? There's a picture there and there's a whole, there's a little bit of text below that. So we need to understand this. And the reason we need to understand the do you know box is first is because it connects to what we just studied. It's an example of traditional historiography, right? And second is to connect it to our question paper. Question paper में एक type का question आता है in which they will put a picture and they will say, describe what you see in the picture, right? That can be for 1 or 2 marks. And then after that, they'll ask you a question on top of that, right? So when you look at this picture, you should be able to describe what you see in it, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and tell you what I see in it. If it was a classroom, I would have asked for participation, and then we'll kind of go ahead with this, right? So if you look at this, this is basically, what is it? It's a stone tablet, right? Yeah, so it's an example of traditional historiography. It's a carving on stone of a battle. So if you look at it, right, I'll just go through all of these. These are soldiers, right? All of these people are soldiers. You can see that's the head, that's the shield, right? And ये जो lines है, वो उनके spears है, right? Which they use to kind of fight with people. So these are soldiers. This is the leader. If you can see, he looks different. He has a different clothing, and they're all fighting. They're going for a war. This looks like a man on a horse. Most soldiers, right? So this is a record of history from the olden times in which they have shown us that some kind of battle, some kind of fight, युद्ध होने वाला है, right? ये सब soldiers है, ये उनका leader है, and they're going to fight, right? So this is an example of the tradition of history. Olden समय में जब लोग लिखते नहीं थे, वो ऐसे इतिहास का record रखते, right? So you should be able to describe what you see. You can say that this is an example of traditional historiography. There are carvings. Carvings मतलब जो हम what they do on the rock, right? Yeah, it's a carving on stone of a battle. There are soldiers with spears. I can see that, and I can see a general or a leader of the army. So you should be able to describe this in your answer when they ask you this in the paper, when and if they ask you this in the paper. And then what we need to understand about this, what the textbook is telling us, is that this is from the Sumerian civilization, which is basically Mesopotamia, which is current day Iraq. यानी कि ये जो पत्थर मिला है वो इराक में उनको मिला है, राइट? तो इराक में बहुत पुराने जमाने में लोग वहां रहते थे, right? In the olden times, people used to live in Iraq. At that time, it was called Mesopotamia, and the civilization was called the Sumerian civilization. I don't know if you have learned, but at the border of India and Pakistan, we have the Indus River, right? और उधर हमारा इंडस वैली सिविलाइजेशन, मोइंजोदारो हड़प्पा सिविलाइजेशन था, right? So there are lots of these old civilizations, very old societies that used to live before, and this is how they used to record history. And this particular rock is the oldest sample of a historical recording. यानी कि ये सबसे पुराना ऐसे ऐतिहासिक record है जो हमें मिला है, जो हमें बताता है, which tells us that history used to be recorded in the past. So it is the oldest record of history, right? It's like the oldest book of history that we can find, except it's not a book, it's a piece of rock. And what it does is it shows us the records of battles between important kingdoms from 4500 BCE. BCE stands for before common era, and we'll go more into this later on in the chapter, right? So fairly simple. You need to describe what you see in the picture, and then you need to know that this is the oldest recording of history. It is from the Sumerian civilization, and it shows us the record of the battles between kingdoms from 4500 BCE, right? If I should go ahead, then please send a yes on the in the chat box. Very nice. Oh, Tushar has participated a little. That's nice. Chand, Khadija, glad to see you all participate. I'll keep the chat box open so I can see your contributions. Okay, so Prachi, Chand, Fuzel, new name. Khadija, Akhilesh, new name. Aarti, Karthik, Lalit, great. That's also new. Thank you. I'll go ahead then. Okay. So far we covered the tradition of historiography, then we saw an example for the tradition of historiography, and we also connected it to the question paper. Now we are going ahead to see modern historiography, right? So we saw traditional, यानी कि पहले का जो होता था by tradition, right, by practice. Now modern historiography, यानी कि आज के जमाने में हम history कैसे लिखते हैं, right? So over here we need to learn the characteristics of modern historiography, and there are a total of 4 characteristics of modern historiography that we need to learn. And once again, I will say you need to connect this to that diagram that we looked at in the beginning of class, right? The diagram of the historical research process, which ends in the writing of the historical narrative. Should I go back and show that to you all quickly? Let's just do that. Okay, so connected to this, what we are going to study now, connected to this, because they are both kind of the same. Okay, so remember we started like this and we did all of this and we end here. Okay. Okay, so modern historiography, there are 4 characteristics, and like we saw in that diagram, the first characteristic of modern historiography is that it is a method based on scientific principles. And when you read this, what should come to your mind is the introduction, where we studied that there's a difference between scientific research and historical research, right? Science में हम experiment करते हैं, हम laws बनाते हैं. In historical research, we can't conduct experiments because we can't go back into the past and conduct experiments. So in historical research, we use evidence to conduct historical research, right? But at the end of the day, what we need to know is science is more reliable. यानी कि जहां भी जब भी हम साइंस के लॉज टेस्ट करेंगे तो वो सेम आते हैं, the results are always the same. But with history, every time we get new information, history changes. So what we need to understand from this is science is more verifiable. Science is more correct, more evidence-based, it's more, how do you say, solid than history, because in science, everything is here and now and testable. In history, everything is pehle ka, and we are always finding new information. So while historical research cannot be like scientific research, we try to make them, thank you, Karthik, accurate is the word I'm looking for. We try to use scientific principles, यानी कि जो scientific तरीका है, जो scientific सोच है, हम उसका इस्तेमाल करने की कोशिश करते हैं जब हम historical research कर रहे हैं, जब हम history लिखने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं, right? Is that okay with everyone? That's important, right? So we try to use scientific principles in historical research. So that's the idea. And if we are using scientific principles, then the first thing in that is we need to start by asking relevant questions. कि अगर मैं हिस्ट्री लिखना चाहता हूं तो मैं पहले सही क्वेश्चन पूछने की कोशिश करूं, right? It's important to ask the right question about history if I want to write good history, right? If I'm teaching you multiplication and you are asking me about biology, then you are not asking the right question, right? So it starts with the formation of relevant questions. What do I need to know? Why do I need to know it? How do I plan on finding out, right? So you need to start by the formation of relevant questions. Then the second characteristic of modern historiography is that the questions we will ask are anthropocentric. Anthropocentric refers to people, anthro, right? So you should always break up words to understand what they mean, right? So anthro refers to people. Anthropology refers to the study of human beings. So anthropocentric मतलब centered around human beings. तो ये जो हम शुरू करेंगे, जो questions के साथ हम शुरू करेंगे, हम वो questions इंसानों के बारे में बनाएंगे, right? Which means that these questions are not about God's actions, they are about people's actions. And we'll understand why this is important in the next part, but basically your takeaway should be this, right? That जब हम इतिहास लिखने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं तो हम भगवान के बारे में नहीं पूछेंगे. अगर अगर if there's an earthquake, we won't ask why did God make an earthquake happen. We will ask, or rather, that's not a good example. If there is a flood, we will not ask why the flood happened, what did God do to make it happen. We will ask, what did the BMC not do, right? कि हम लोगों ने क्या नहीं किया हमारा रोड, हमारा गटर साफ करने के लिए कि फ्लड हो गया, right? So when we are writing history, we need to ask anthropocentric questions, not about gods, right? And we'll understand why later. But it's about people's actions in the past, right? So that's an important thing that we need to know. Then we'll go ahead. The next thing is that we need to find reliable evidence to prove the answers to these questions. तो जब भी हम historical research कर रहे हैं, हमारे सामने 100-200 किताब आएंगे, maybe paintings आएंगे, वो carving आएगा. Now, all of this will not be reliable, dependable evidence. Some of it can be fake, some of it can be inaccurate. So I need to know which things to refer to, right? Which are reliable. To use an example for you all, अगर आप अपने दोस्तों के नोट्स का इस्तेमाल कर रहे हो तो आपके पास 5 बच्चों के नोट्स रहेंगे, 5 दोस्त के नोट्स रहेंगे, एंड यू विल नो ना कि कौन सा बच्चा सही से पढ़ता है, कौन से बच्चे का नोट सही है, and you'll study from that child's notes. You won't study from the ones who don't pay attention properly or who don't understand things properly, right? So similarly, when we are studying history, we take reliable evidence, right? And the last thing is that once we've asked the relevant questions, we found the answers to those questions with reliable evidence, then we will start writing history. And when we write history, the aim is to present a graph of mankind's journey with the help of a record of their actions. यानी कि हम एक कहानी लिखने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं कि इंसान कैसे आगे बढ़े टाइम के साथ, right? How did not one person, but how did mankind move forward, right? Over time. So that's the broad idea. Actually, there are 3 things you need to know, right? So formation of relevant questions, answering those relevant questions with reliable evidence, and presenting a graph of mankind's journey. Those are the 3 steps, and within that, in the formation of relevant questions, you need to know कि ये questions कौन से type के हैं. ये questions इंसानों के बारे में, right? They're anthropocentric. They are about people, not about gods. And so the process kind of becomes like this, right? So formation of relevant questions, they are anthropocentric questions. Then we answer these questions with reliable evidence. And then we present a graph of mankind's journey through our writing of history. So that's the idea. If that's clear to everyone, just say yes, and then I'll move on. Okay. Aarti has said I'm speaking too fast. Aarti and Kusum, is there anything I should repeat? Sorry, I'm speaking fast. I should have paid attention to that. Should I repeat anything? 8:27, you said that 5 minutes ago. I'm waiting for your response, Aarti Kusum Shastri. Aarti Bania Kusum Shastri. Okay. I'll speak more slowly now. Okay. All right. So this is the process of modern historiography. Thank you for everyone who replied. Aditya, Chanda, Muskan, Alfia, Chand, Karthik, Ankit, Prachi, Fuzel. So now I'll go ahead to the last part of modern historiography. So that we have this process. That's 3 steps, out of which the first step has an extra little point there of anthropocentric questions. And the last thing we need to know in modern historiography is that modern historiography, how did it start, right? So what is the origin of modern historiography? And in that, we need to know that it started in ancient Greek historical writing. Greek is like how you say Indian, right? So Indians are from India, Greeks are from Greece, okay? So it started in ancient Greek historical writing. The word history was first used by the Greek historian Herodotus in a book called The Histories in 5th century BCE. right? So modern historiography का ये जो technique हमने अभी सीखा है, right? The formation of relevant questions, this technique that we just learned. The first time this technique was learned and the first time the word history was used was in the book, The Histories by Herodotus, right? Where he used the word history in 5th century BCE. And what I want you all to do is by next class, and we'll use this information in next class, I want you to find out where is Greece, right? Where is Greece? I want you all to find out. And I also want you all to find out what does 5th century BCE mean? Okay, I don't want answers now, but you need to find this out for next class. It's part of your homework. Okay, I'll tell you all in the next class, but I want you all to find out and tell me. That will be better. So write it down, scan it, and send it to Siddharth sir as a PDF, so I can check your answers. We can have a discussion in next class. Okay. BCE means before Common Era, but I want you all to tell me what does 5th century BCE mean, right? So figure it out. Shall I move ahead? Is this simple enough? But say yes if I should move ahead. Thank you, Chand, Tushar, Karthik, Karina, Bhavesh, that's a new name. Lalit, Muskan. Okay, great. So just to recap, we've covered 1.1. For 3 points. You should, I'm not doing this for time pass, okay? Yeah, I think my internet, there was a problem there for a minute. I'll repeat. I'm recapping. I'm not doing this for time pass. I'm doing this because you need to have this in your head, right? So tradition of historiography, there were 3 points: the definition, the conceptual framework, and what traditional historiography was. Then we did the do you know box. Then we did the modern historiography, 4 characteristics. So 4 points over there. Plus we did this thing about the origin of modern historiography, which is an additional point. So modern historiography, that brings us to a total of 5 points that we need to have in our head, right? Which is the process or the characteristics of modern historiography. And then where did it start? Where was the word history used for the first time? Now we'll come to the last part of today's class. How are we doing on time? Okay, not bad. The last thing that we need to do today is understand how the scientific perspective developed in Europe, how scientific perspective and historiography developed in Europe. Before this, we just understood that in historiography हम scientific principles का इस्तेमाल करने की कोशिश करते हैं by asking relevant questions, and we understood that those relevant questions are anthropocentric. And वहां पे मैंने बोला anthropocentric का मतलब है लोगों के बारे में, भगवान के बारे में नहीं, right? So there's a reason I said that, and that is because of this, right? 18th century के पहले जब लोग इतिहास के बारे में लिखते थे या इतिहास के बारे में बात करते थे, तो वो भगवान के बारे में बात करते थे, right? So if any event happened in the past, they would explain it through stories of gods, right? They would say, because this happened, this god got angry, so this happened, or because this happened, this god was happy, so this god made this happen. पहले के जमाने में, before the 18th century, we would discuss history by including gods in it. We would write that everything that happened happened because of the gods or in some relation to gods. After the 18th century, we progressed, or during the 18th century, we progressed, philosophy and science progressed. And because of that, people began to have this idea that even in history, we can apply scientific principles. Is that okay with y'all? That's important, okay? And then the peak or the important thing that happened during the 18th century is that in 1737, Göttingen University, which is a university in Germany, okay? So Göttingen University opened their first history department. पहले कभी भी एक history department अलग सा था नहीं, right? But in 1737, because history started becoming more scientific, because it started becoming more formal, more modern, university में उसका एक department बना, right? And that was a big step forward for history, because then जब हिस्ट्री को यूनिवर्सिटी में पढ़ाना शुरू करते हैं तो ऑटोमेटिकली वो एक सब्जेक्ट बनता है, वो उसका एक इज्जत बनता है, एक लेवल बनता है, right? So in 1737, Göttingen University opened their own history department, and after that a lot of different universities in Germany and then eventually across the world started opening their own historical departments. And that helped move history forward, right? Because the more people who come into universities and who start to look at history from that scientific perspective, the more history moves ahead, right? So that's broadly what they've explained in 1.3. It's 3 points. The first point is, before 18th century, people only discuss history by discussing gods. During the 18th century, philosophy and science progressed. Because philosophy and science progressed, people started thinking they could apply scientific principles to history. And a big event that happened to lead this progress forward is in 1737, Göttingen University opened their own history department. So the subject started becoming serious, started becoming modern. So these are the 3 points you broadly need to know if you're ever asked a question, right, in your paper, how did scientific perspective of history develop in Europe? Is that okay with everyone? It's just 3 points. You should be thinking always how to answer in the exam. Okay, thank you, Khadija. Waiting for more responses. Thank you, Chanda. Thank you, Chand. Aarti, Bhavesh. Great. Okay. Always happy for more responses. Great. Okay. Lakshmi, Prachi, Karthik. Great. So that's a wrap for today. What we've completed today is we've already completed the introduction. So today we covered the tradition of historiography, in that there were 3 broad points, right? You should be able to recall them in your head now. What were they? What is historiography? What is a conceptual framework? And what was the tradition of historiography in the past, right? After that, we did modern historiography. In modern historiography, we learned 4 characteristics, and we learned where the word history was used for the first time. The 4 characteristics were asking relevant questions. The relevant questions should be anthropocentric. After that, it was finding answers to those questions based on reliable evidence. And the last point in that was presenting a graph of mankind's journey. And then we learned that Herodotus, that was the last thing that we learned, Herodotus used the word history in his book, The Histories, for the first time. He's from Greece. And I gave you homework to find out where is Greece and what is 5th century BCE. And then we did development of scientific perspectives in Europe, where we understood anthropocentric questions ki zarurat kyun hai. Why? Because first we used to only talk about history in terms of gods. Then we started progressing in science and philosophy, and we started believing we can use scientific principles in history. And then Göttingen University in 1737 started with a history department, and then lots of other universities had history departments. They shouldn't say 1, they should say 3. Let me just fix that now. Should say 3. That was 3 points over there. Okay. Okay. And now in our next class next week, I'll discuss the schedule with Siddharth sir. I'd like to wrap it up next week for sure. So maybe more classes, or we'll see. But in the next class, we'll be diving into the most important part of the chapter, which is notable scholars, right? So I think there are about 8 notable scholars that we need to learn about. And we'll be using a little framework. So I think you all would remember I told you all about techniques to study history, right? So we'll be using one of those techniques to study about these notable scholars. And your homework for the next class, which will probably be on Monday. First class will surely be on Monday. I just may take more than 2 classes next week. So this is your homework. You need to find out where is Greece, what does 5th century BCE mean, and in your exercise, you need to solve these two questions, right? Question 4, part 1, and question 6, part 2. If you've made a note of all of this, then you